Today, most of the Muslim majority countries, with about 1.4 billion people or inhabitants, are not only ruled by authoritarian and corrupt regimes, but also face huge economic, political, social challenges, such as high unemployment, estimated in the Arab world to be around 30% and rising, high poverty rates, high illiteracy rates, estimated in some countries to be between 55 and 65%. In fact, in many countries, it's over 50% illiteracy rate today. In every scale of human development, Muslim countries rank, and especially Arab countries, rank at or near the bottom today. What is the solution to this crisis? And how can we, as scholars, activists, political and religious leaders, develop a path forward that leads to peace, prosperity, stability, development, dignity, and good relations with other countries? Can democracy and good governance, along with transparency and accountability, pave the way for a stable, confident, and prosperous Middle East and Muslim world? What are the main challenges for democracy in the Muslim world? And can we, as Americans, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who are interested in peace and prosperity, what can we do to help alleviate these problems and support democratic voices and movements and leaders in the Middle East and the Muslim world? As President Bush stated and indeed admitted in November 2003, the US and European countries are partly responsible for the current crisis because for the last 50 or 60 years, meaning since the end of occupation or since independence, we have been propping up and supporting dictators and corrupt rulers in the Arab and Muslim world in the name of providing stability and security. The calls for freedom and democracy are not new in the Arab world or the Muslim world. Arabs and Muslims have struggled for freedom and democracy for decades, if not centuries. For example, according to Amnesty International, there were between 200,000 and 250,000 political prisoners in the Arab world around the year 2000. 250,000 political prisoners in the Arab world in the year 2000. Today that number is less, but still a huge number of political prisoners. And in Egypt alone, it's estimated to be around 30,000. So people have been struggling against oppression and against dictatorship for a very long time. But for decades, we in the US and in the West have turned our back to Democrats and reformers in the Arab and Muslim world, and have instead supported authoritarian and oppressive regimes. Of course, now we are discovering that these regimes provided neither stability nor security. Rather, they were and still are creating conditions for popular anger, discontent, and despair, which sooner or later will express itself as rage, violence, and extremism. Terrorism is, of course, the most violent form of this rage and anger, but is not the only form, which finds its roots in the terrible conditions that millions of people, especially young people, find themselves in today. Anger and despair, combined with youth and lack of education, form a very dangerous powder cake. Today, and after only 3 years of the forward strategy of freedom in the Middle East, we are witnessing and hearing some skeptics and decision makers inside and outside the administration who want the US to stop promoting democracy, because democracy, in their eyes, will not benefit US interests or will not benefit so-called liberals in the Middle East. Let us be clear that promoting democracy is not easy and certainly has risks involved. And has risks associated with it. But the alternative The alternative of supporting democracy is supporting the status quo. The alternative of supporting democracy is supporting oppressive regimes. That policy has been tried for the last 40 years, and we know where it leads. We know the outcome. Its outcome is certain. More oppression, more corruption, more poverty, more despair, more anger and frustration, and a rising anti-American tide, and even extremist tide, that will be very dangerous for the region and for the world. In the 21st century, it is no longer possible to keep millions of people, in fact, close to 1 billion or more, oppressed and repressed by corrupt and unpopular regimes, while the rest of the world enjoys freedom, dignity, development, and rising standard of living. In fact, it's important to remember that the support or the rising support for Islamic and Islamist parties today did not exist a mere 20 or 30 years ago, and is clearly the result of the despair and hopelessness that these failed, quote-unquote, secular states have led their countries to. Out of despair, people, and especially young people, are turning to Islam as their last hope to unite, mobilize, and fix the ills of their societies. In addition, there are many positive and encouraging signs that Islamic parties and groups are now seeing the necessity of political participation, democratization, and reforms as the only way to resolve the myriad of problems and challenges that they and their societies face. There are indications that Islamic parties, when they come to power or parliament through the ballot box, they become more practical and pragmatic and less ideological and intransigent. Politics, after all, is the art of compromise, and Islamists are learning this art, and they must learn this art if they want to succeed in politics. Certainly, the experience of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey is a very good model for other Islamist parties to follow. And tonight we will be happy to hear from the Secretary General of the Party of Justice and Development in Morocco, which is trying to develop a similar path in North Africa. In Islam and Islamic jurisprudence, we must distinguish between primary and fundamental principles and secondary judgments or opinions of scholars. We need to reopen the door of ijtihad to come up with a modern Islamic thought and jurisprudence, fiqh, that is not only compatible with the basic and most important principles of Islam, but also addresses the new situations and conditions of modern societies in the 21st century. For example, we need to focus on the ideas of citizenship, which have not really been developed in Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic historical theories, political theories, but are extremely important concepts today, the idea of citizenship and citizenship rights and duties. And for example, I'd like to mention that CSID has been working on a program for democracy education focusing on this idea of citizenship, and we published last year in cooperation with Street Law, another NGO based here in Washington, a new book in Arabic called Islam and Democracy Towards Effective Citizenship. And it has 6 chapters trying to develop the ideas from Islamic principles and the principles of democracy and human rights, trying to develop this idea of citizenship and strengthening it within Islamic jurisprudence. And this book right now is being used in 4 countries to train 400 people in Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, and Jordan. And we hope that the book will continue to be used to train many, many other people, and hundreds, if not thousands of people. We're especially trying to target imams, for example, with this book, trying to educate religious leaders about the concept of citizenship, again, from an Islamic perspective. Similarly, the relationship between religion and state needs further investigation and clarification. Religious beliefs and practices should not be controlled by the state. This damages both the state and religion. Nobody, especially Muslims, want to live in a democracy, in a theocracy, where religion is forced or imposed from above. In our conferences and seminars that we organize throughout the region, throughout the Middle East and North Africa and other Muslim countries, we always try to bring both secularists and Islamists, specifically moderate Islamists, together and get them to agree and discuss common objectives and strategies. We were very pleased, for example, to find in most of these places, in most of these countries, Islamists, moderate Islamists, and secularists often agree that they want a democracy governed by Islamic values, but where individual rights are protected and equal rights and duties are accorded to all citizens, irrespective of their ethnic or religious background. Equal rights for citizens is an essential component of democracy and of Islam. There are many other issues that need to be studied and clarified today, and they require Muslim leaders and scholars to come up with new answers and interpretations. However, ijtihad cannot succeed or happen under a dictatorship, which stifles dissent and forbids free debates and discussions. This is another reason why democracy is a priority for the Muslim world and why Muslim Americans can be at the vanguard of both the movement toward democracy and the movement for a more modern interpretation of Islam. Without democracy, there can be no real or meaningful ijtihad. I believe democracy is coming to the Middle East and to the Arab world and the Muslim world, whether we like it or not, and with or without our help. These regimes and governments are too weak, too discredited, and too corrupt to last much longer. The only question, therefore, is whether we, as Americans and as free people of the world, will support the aspirations for freedom, democracy, and dignity in the Arab and Muslim world, or will go back to supporting Arab dictators and doing business as usual with corrupt and unpopular regimes. I believe it is in the long interest and benefit of the United States that we support the people's aspirations to freedom and democracy, so that we are on the right side of history, and so that we can build future relations based on respect, dignity, and mutual understanding. As American citizens, it is our responsibility, and I believe moral obligation, to make sure that our government will never go back to supporting authoritarian and oppressive regimes in the Arab and Muslim world. We are making very rapid progress in the democratization of the Arab and Muslim world, I believe. This does not mean that we will have full democracy tomorrow or next year. But I am very optimistic that we will see some real and successful democracies in the Arab and Muslim world in the next 10 years or so. In any case, we have no choice but to do our best to make sure this happens, because the alternative is simply impossible to sustain or even to contemplate. I urge you to join me and support CSID in our efforts to build a more peaceful, democratic, prosperous Middle East and Muslim world. Thank you very much for attending this conference today and tomorrow. We look forward to very fruitful presentations and discussions, and more importantly, we look forward to working with all of you in building a better future for the Muslim world and for all of us and for our children. Thank you very much for coming today.
My talk is titled Towards an Experiment in Libertarian Political Islam. And this is, it may sound like an odd combination. Libertarianism means maximizing the freedom of individuals and groups in society from interference by the state, by the central apparatus of government. And that seems to run counter to what most critics of Islamism describe as Islamism. And it also seems to run counter to the ideology of many Muslim movements right now that have gained a lot of popularity, especially the ones that Professor Ottaway just referred to, that position themselves as oppositionist parties to ruling parties. It seems that they don't, the presumption is that everything gets better once they capture the state, once they capture the organs of government, because then they can use the state to bring about a new vision, a new social order that introduces legislation according to Islam, or something a little closer to Islamic precepts on society, and somehow that will improve things. And I'm suggesting that there is a vibrant, deeply rooted scriptural, jurisprudential, historical, and moral basis for the argument that in fact a Muslim political order is one that maximizes the moral choice on the part of the individual and on the part of local communities, and that the way to maximize this is to minimize the ability of the central state organization to impose its will on those individuals and on those local communities. So I'm going to be trying to spell out in some detail for you today the basis of that vision, and I'll do that by reference to a common term that is used to disparage Muslim movements, the term called Islamofascism, describe what I see as its radical opposite, which is Islamic libertarianism. But also there's another concept which we don't hear enough about, in my opinion, which really gets at the potential for serious juristic disagreement and deliberation in the public sphere, and this is the concept of istihsan. And I would suggest that, and I'm following Imam Malik bin Anas here, who said that that this is really 9/10 of the religion, the process of istihsan, and it's my opinion that istihsan is best realized through the activity of public deliberation. In other words, the presence of moral, deliberating citizens that are engaged in common issues together, and of necessity, it allows for the possibility of differences in opinion lasting on almost every question that exists out there in religious law. So that's one that I would like to develop in some detail. And then there are a few other aspects of juristic tradition that I'll point to, such as, of course, the well-known, well-established plurality of madhabs, the limits on state power that are widely described in things such as the prohibitions on backbiting and spying, the tradition of incorporating local habits or customs called urf in Islamic law, and the fact that there is a pluralistic reality out there almost anywhere that we look out at the Muslim world, and the necessity of covenanting people together, bringing them together in a common political organization, is one that cannot go forward, cannot move without respecting and protecting that plurality and that difference. Personal point of view, it seems to me that you cannot have authentic submission, you cannot have authentic Islam without the choice being available to you. If you are coerced into certain actions and that choice is not genuinely available to you, you cannot be a moral agent, which is what we are called to be as Muslims. So that's the first kind of personal part, speaking as a Muslim, about where the motivation for this particular normative vision of a political state comes from. The second part is a new body of literature that has emerged in the last 20 years in political economy that is called the New Institutionalism. And the New Institutionalism has been very effective at detailing the fact that government or governance happens all the time in virtually every arena that you can think of. Anytime you have a rule that shapes how you interact with others in society, and that rule comes with some sort of benefit and some sort of sanction, some sort of monitoring and some sort of reward or punishment, that is a form of government, and it does not have to all flow top down from the central apparatus of the state to the bottom rungs of society. And I think the wrong presumption that is used both by critics of Muslim efforts at an Islamic version of democracy, and this is also the wrong presumption shared by some of the oppositional Islamist parties, is that the way forward is to capture the central state and impose that vision. I think that would rob society of that moral choice. So let me elaborate on this by suggesting first of all, that the popular image right now that is widely used, and you'll hear about this from Rush Limbaugh, if he's out of jail yet, I'm not sure, or Donald Rumsfeld, this presumption that an appropriate characterization of Islamism is as fascists. This presumption that they are Islamo-fascist movements out there, and that I feel this is a rhetorical device that is a reflection of the effort to paint the current war on terror as something like World War IV. This has been used by people like James Woolsey, others who are trying to mobilize the public opinion in favor of these interventionist wars. And this effort is it's just a way to link Islamist movements to odious regimes in history. But beyond the political rhetoric alone, it has gained some currency in scholarship. So you have a scholar such as the historian Shari Berman, who's a specialist in European fascism, who herself makes the claim that there are some parallels and some similarities between Islamist political organizations and the origins of European fascist movements. So let me say that what fascism tries to do is to minimize individual choice and to place social and human resources at the disposal of the state to be allocated and directed for state purposes. In other words, fascism is about minimizing the ability of the individual to choose what they do with their lives and their wealth. In this sense, the fascist ideology is the supreme approval and justification for dictatorship. Furthermore, we know that fascists are most successful in wartime because they can best justify allocating social resources for their state purposes. And this means that fascist political orders are associated with aggression and warlike behavior. And so from that point of view, as both a rhetorical device as well as an academic charge, I think the label of Islamofascism needs to be taken seriously, but examined critically. You will see that there are certain political movements out there, such as some versions of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Islamic Liberation Party, which have adopted policies that are reflections of other movements around the world, especially the developing world, from newly decolonized countries, that demand that the state take control over over society's resources to best protect it from future intrusions and to allow it to move forward rapidly, and that they justify this in all sorts of ways. I once had a debate with a Hizb ut-Tahrir representative, and I remember that he made a bold statement that there's a hadith about the role of natural resources, and therefore an Islamic state must take complete ownership of all petroleum in the country. And I found this rather remarkable that he's able to translate this to a kind of direct control over resources. And there are a number of other aspects of the Tahrir agenda that does this. And it seems to me that other movements, and I won't go into more details of it right now in the interest of covering the remainder of what I have to say, but I think you can find elements of this in the Taliban also. And the suggestion that I'm making is that the opposite experiment, an experiment in Islamo-libertarianism, is likely to correct some of the problems inherent with the more capture the state version. And that is a situation in which we have to understand that capturing the state can only produce social change to the extent that a state is politically capable. And let me define what I mean by political capacity. Political capacity can be understood as the ability to allocate and reallocate resources for state purposes. And so you have a situation where many countries in the Muslim world right now feature states that are weak states in the sense that even if they adopted a deeply entrenched fascist top-down control ideology, they would not be able to allocate most resources simply because they don't have deep reach into society, and they don't have the ability to do that nearly as much as something like wartime Germany was able to do, for example. So both on a kind of moral level of the problem of coercion for moral choice, as well as a practical level on the actual implementation of these agendas, I think this is a failing approach. And the opposite version the Islamo-libertarianism requires understanding what libertarianism is. And let me start with a short distinction between two forms and suggest for you the one form that I think is more suitable for the experiment in libertarian political Islam. So this is a quote from Nicholas Haywood, who's a political theorist, and he writes that although all libertarians reject government's attempts to redistribute wealth and deliver social justice, a division can nevertheless be drawn between those libertarians who subscribe to anarcho-capitalism and view the state as an unnecessary evil, and those who recognize the need for a minimal state, sometimes styling themselves as minarchists. Libertarian theories provide a constant reminder of the oppressive potential that resides within all actions of government. However, criticisms of libertarianism fall into two general categories. One sees the rejection of any form of welfare or redistribution as an example of capitalist ideology. The other highlights an imbalance in libertarian philosophy that allows it to stress rights but ignore responsibilities, and which values individual effort and ability, but fails to take into account the extent to which these are a product of the social environment. So in other words, there are two contested versions of libertarianism out there. One of them is more anarchist than the other. And it seems to me that the models and the approach that is most appropriate to our current context, as well as being most consonant with Muslim political and jurisprudential history, is the minarchist form. In other words, a form where a central state does provide certain basic protections, where it does guarantee the collective defense against outside intervention and outside manipulation, and where it does introduce some minimal redistribution of resources according to zakat rules as a way to prevent extremes in economic inequality from resulting in rigid oppressions over time. But beyond that, does not intrude further except as a matter of